Hello and welcome to Lost Love Chronicles. You're not getting it to force. I'll put you in an asylum, and I'll visit occasionally with my next lover. Better yet, I'll make you crawl back to me, and make you watch me have sex with young studs, while you serve me champagne. The words pierced on my heart and killed the very shred of love I had for my wife. Let me take you back a few days. On the eve of my 50th birthday, I decided to forego the typical workplace celebration. Retirement was looming, and without much fanfare, I gathered my closest associates in my office. We cracked open a couple of bottles of whiskey, indulged in a few snacks, and engaged in heartfelt conversations. As the clock neared 8 in the evening, we bid our goodbyes and headed home. I was in no condition to drive, so I called a cab and made my way home without sparking any debates with my wife. No demands were made. I simply undressed and crashed in the hall. The next day, the head of the department handed me a pension certificate and a box containing a tea set as a parting gift. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of betrayal, though the chief attempted to show support, signaling that the decision came from higher up. I accepted the certificate, shook the sweaty palm of the man who delivered the news, and left the office without uttering a word. Yuri, my former boss, pleaded for me to hand over my responsibilities to a new employee, but I brushed it off, stating I was off to go fishing. This phase of my life had come to an end. I loaded up a box of my belongings into the trunk, placed the tea set on the seat, and took the wheel of my SUV. With no particular destination in mind, I decided to drop the boxes off at our country house, a property that, truth be told, belonged more to my wife. It was a place she had earned through her success in law, a field she had excelled in while I lingered in the shadows. Our journey together started in college, marrying young while she pursued law, and I delved into the Polytechnic Department of Radio Engineering. Our family expanded with the birth of our son, Dima, shortly after our wedding, followed by our daughter, Moshe, 4 years later. After serving 2 years in the Army, I worked in my institute specialty, while Sveta carved her niche in business law, eventually establishing a thriving law firm. As the years passed, Sveta earned fame and credibility in our city, handling complex cases for rich and famous businessmen. Meanwhile, I remained content in the background, not bothered by the overshadowing success of my wife. She had always been considerate of my preferences, knowing well that social events and parties were not my cup of tea. I found solace in hunting and the occasional fishing trip. While I didn't actively participate in Sveta's social circles, it didn't mean I was oblivious to her activities. Sveta, an attractive woman with beautiful legs and a tight figure, garnered attention from men eager to capture her interest. Yet, she remained steadfast in upholding family values, and I had no reason to suspect any betrayal. As time passed, our children grew up, with my son marrying and relocating to the capital, bringing the joy of a grandson into our lives. My daughter, too, graduated from university and began living independently. With the kids out of the house, we found a certain freedom. Sveta had overseen the construction of a spacious country house, allowing us to enjoy fresh air away from the city's pollution. As I pulled up to the house, I noticed Sveta's car parked in the driveway, a surprise considering she was supposed to be at work. Plans could have changed, I thought. Taking my time, I ascended to the second floor, carrying boxes of miscellaneous items. I carefully arranged them in my office and was about to head back down to the car when strange noises emanated from the guest bedroom at the end of the hall. Intrigued and somewhat concerned, I approached the source of the commotion, my senses on high alert. Surprise and alarm gripped me as I approached the loosely closed door, behind which emanated painfully familiar noises. It was the sound of Sveta in the throes of passion, a phase of lovemaking I thought I knew all too well after years of married life. However, the voice accompanying hers was alien to my ears. My wife's cries of pleasure were intermingled with passionate affirmations. "Do you feel good with me?" "Yes, yes, you the best, better than a husband," fervently answered Sveta. For some reason, a bitter laugh escaped me. The irony struck me hard. My successful and respectable wife, a mother of 2, and a grandmother of 5, referring to herself as the best for some scoundrel. Oh, how the times and manners had changed. Summoning a mix of courage and disbelief, I opened the door. A few minutes passed as Sveta, mid-coitus, took a sidelong glance at my motionless figure. She pushed her playmate away, and her lover, presumably, crawled under the sheet, feigning non-existence. Sveta, unfazed, jumped down to the floor and headed toward me as if nothing had transpired. I looked at her naked figure, a lump forming in my throat. "Yura, do not make a scene. Go to town, we'll talk in the evening," she told me with a calmness that would suggest she was sending me on a routine errand. In the haze of the moment, I stood there, stunned. I could have erupted in anger, confronted her lover, thrown the cheating wife out of the house, but her words echoed in my mind. Words spoken in the heat of passion, declaring, "You're better than a husband." It felt like a verdict, an unforgivable judgment on our family. Tears, sobbing, remorse, I expected them all, but instead, I was met with a calm, emotionless voice that delivered a verdict on our life together. It wasn't forgivable. Gritting my teeth, I muttered through clenched jaws, "At least cover up." I turned and walked out, the coincidental loss of both my job and my wife hitting me almost simultaneously. Sveta, for me, was already in the past, and I harbored no doubts about that. Refusing to succumb to hysteria, I didn't ask why. I didn't sob uncontrollably, plugging a pillow. Instead, I absorbed the blow of fate, understanding that the only course of action was to gather my thoughts. The first order of business was to address the housing problem. Technically, I had a 1/4 share in an apartment and a country house, but I knew all too well that Sveta's lawyers would leave me with nothing. Even the car was registered in her name. Glancing at my watch, which read 1 o'clock, I decided it was time to take action. I pulled over to the curb and took out my smartphone. A lakeside home for sale caught my eye, a quiet, peaceful place with great fishing and hunting, and the price was quite affordable for me. I dialed the contact number listed in the ad, and a woman answered. She explained that her father had built the house upon returning from the seas, living there until his death. The house had been vacant for almost a year until the new owner decided to sell. Situated deep in the woods, surrounded by kilometers of thick forest, the remote location had led to a gradual reduction in the house's price. I was okay with that and offered a little more, but I requested a deed of gift to avoid any legal entanglements, given that I was still technically married. An hour later, we met at the notary's office and executed the contract. I had just purchased my own country house. The woman told me where the key to the front door was, bid me farewell, and left in a cab. Wasting no time, I headed to the apartment and began packing. Several times, Sveta called, but I chose not to answer. Ignoring the flood of text messages, I focused on gathering my belongings. Calling a cab, I tossed the keys to the apartment and the car into the mailbox. A cab ride to the garage revealed my father's car, in pristine condition and ready to go. I threw my backpack into a large bag in the trunk, warmed up the engine, and, taking my time, set off to open a new chapter in my life. As my car raced down the highway, dispersing the light snow that had fallen overnight, I left a fast-fading trail behind. After about 30 kilometers, I turned off the highway onto a dirt road and encountered a solid wall of forest, stretching for dozens of kilometers according to the map. The farther I drove, the narrower the road became. Slowing down, I found myself surrounded by a dense forest. The road skirted the shore for a while before turning sharply to the left. Approaching a small, blackened-by-time log house standing on the lake shore, I noticed a few apple trees drowning in overgrown weeds. A high fence ran down to the water, and from the lake's side, I could see a pier on wooden stanchions driven into the water. I stopped the car, shut off the engine, and got out, examining my new purchase with curiosity. The air was filled with the smell of algae, damp dust, and decaying rags. The house stared out at me through windows reflecting the crimson sun dipping behind the pine tops. Made of treated pine logs, the walls stood sturdy, and the roof was covered with slate. A small porch and a massive door, padded with wrought iron, greeted me. Wooden doors leaned against the wall, and a log barn stood on low wooden piles nearby, appearing to be used for storing firewood. Behind the barn, by the water, stood a bathhouse. Climbing up to the low porch, I reached over the door and found a rusty key. Unscrewing the shackle, I carefully removed the lock and pulled the forged handle of the door toward me. Expecting to find a mess of cobwebs and abandoned items, I was pleasantly surprised. The room was clean and fairly comfortable, albeit cold and faintly smelling of mice. In the middle of the room, a cast-iron stove sat on a steel plate lined with wild stone, with neatly stacked wood beside it. A nickel-plated iron bed stood by the far wall, adorned with a protective colored wool blanket and a well-made wolf skin instead of a rock. Above the bed hung roe deer antlers, and on a wide tarpaulin belt, an old rifle dangled. A table made of oak with carved legs stood by the window, offering a beautiful view of the lake and a small pine-covered island at its center. To the right of the front door, an antique cabinet sat, next to an equally old refrigerator. An old painting adorned the opposite wall, flanked by an antique ship's clock and steering wheel, suggesting a former owner with ties to the Navy. I checked the clock. It was 6:15. Closing my eyes, I immersed myself in the silence of the surroundings. The day had been quite eventful. I had received my pension certificate in the morning, feeling content, but by lunchtime, I was without a wife and a familiar corner. Now, in the evening, I found myself in the middle of the woods. I pondered why I chose this seemingly remote place, even though it was less than 40 kilometers from the city. Pulling the car closer to the porch, I started carrying my belongings into the house. The air inside was rather cold, so my first order of business was to heat the stove. I found a switch in the hallway, and as I flicked it, the light bulb under the ceiling brightened. The refrigerator rumbled like a well-fed cat as I organized my things in the closet and stashed groceries in the fridge. Outside, darkness fell rapidly with twilight creeping through the windows. It was time to think about dinner. An electric stove in the hallway caught my eye, but I decided not to bother. Opting for convenience, I opened a can of porridge and put it on the stove. 10 minutes later, dinner was ready, and I ate quickly, leaving the tea for later. As I ate, darkness settled outside. To occupy myself, I decided to explore the closet. On the bottom shelf, just under the hanger, I found a large tarpaulin bundle tied with twine. Carefully untying the twine, I unwrapped the cloth and couldn't believe my eyes. A disassembled double-barreled shotgun, a 16-gauge. I was in luck. The gun was well oiled, though slightly rusted. I decided cleaning it would be a productive activity. After assembling the gun, I opened other drawers, finding rags, gun oil, and, to my great joy, ammunition. 20 rounds in an unopened oil pack. Draping the top over the table, I placed the gun on it, fractured it, and examined the barrels. Taking a metal can of gun oil from the table drawer, I cleaned my weapon. It felt as if the gun had rejuvenated after the cleaning. I loaded it with ammunition, put the safety on, and just as I finished, the phone rang again. The screen displayed "Sweetheart." I hesitated but finally answered. Sveda's voice vibrated with anger, asking where I was. Silent, I didn't want to engage in conversation. She continued talking about the need to discuss matters and mentioned filing for divorce tomorrow. I spoke slowly, controlling my emotions, suggesting that we meet at the courthouse at 11 o'clock to discuss everything. Sveta turned off the phone abruptly. Outside, something crunched. The rain softly drummed on the glass, but an audible sound caught my attention. I looked outside and saw an indistinct shadow flickering by the fence in the dim light from the window. Subconsciously, I realized someone was in the yard, lurking in the tall weeds, watching me through the lighted window. Acting on an unknown instinct, I picked up my gun, carefully clicked the safety catch, and extinguished the light. Cautiously holding the gun at the ready, I looked out the window without dressing. I pushed the front door with my foot and stepped out onto the porch unobtrusively. Who's there? Come out. I shouted and raised my rifle. Don't shoot. A frightened voice answered from the darkness, and a woman in an overdressed and knitted cap of an incomprehensible color came into the light. Who are you? I asked, taken aback. Lucia. I live not far from here in the village, about 5 kilometers away. Ivan was struck today, so he kicked me out. I've slept here a few times before, and now I thought the house was empty, the woman explained quickly. It seemed strange. I hadn't seen any sign of a woman in the house. Oh, don't you think so? I always clean up after myself, and I haven't touched a thing. The stranger seemed to read my mind. If you'll excuse me, I have to go. The woman turned and walked into the darkness. For some reason, my heart ached. She seemed as lost as I was. Wait for me. I shouted after the hunched-over figure in the ray. Come inside, get warm. The woman stood for a while, as if hesitating, then turned around and went hesitantly to the porch. Without undressing, she sat down on the edge of a stool. The room was already hot. Take off your coat. I'll hang it by the stove to dry, I said, holding out my hand. She hesitantly took off her coat and hat. She wasn't old at all, about 45 years old, with unwashed hair and a bruise under her right eye. Ivan was evidently a harsh man. The woman had a stale nightie under her coat. She must have jumped out in what she was wearing, just her coat and hat. I looked at her feet. They were in a man's rubber boots, 5 sizes larger. Lucia caught my gaze and tried to put her feet under the stool. How often does Ivan treat you this way? I asked, hanging my coat on the back of the chair. No, once or twice a week. He's good, but when he drinks, he swears. The woman tried to cover the yellow bruises on her arms with the short sleeves of her nightie. He shelters me, feeds me, clothes me. Well, he's a husband. I grinned, remembering Sveta. He is supposed to support his wife. We are not married, so we live. I help him with the household, with the children. His wife died, and now he has 3 children left, Lucia sighed. I sleep in the old banya. There's no room in the house. I only stay at home when he feels like it, or when friends come over. She didn't finish and blushed. What morals? Ivan's not greedy either, sharing his woman with his friends. Why don't you get away from such a life? Where to? Who needs me? And I don't have a passport. Lucia was silent, with her head down. It seemed to me that she silently cried. I took stewed meat out of the fridge and put the kettle on the stove. There was not much food. I did not count on guests, but it was better than nothing. I thought about it, I said, cutting bread, and got vodka. Poured a little bit into an aluminium mug. Have a drink, otherwise, you'll get sick. The woman took the mug and looked at me apprehensively. Drink, it's vodka, I insisted. The guest ate and began to speak. I looked out the window. The rain had increased, and the wind was rumbling over the lake. Even inside the house, I could hear the waves crashing against the pier. All right, stay here, spend the night. And tomorrow you'll go to your Ivan, I said to Licia. The weather's gone bad. You'll get lost again. The woman, languishing in the warmth of food and vodka, seemed relieved. Ivan hadn't spoiled her much. It was evident from her demeanor. I helped her to the bed, laid her down, and covered her with a blanket. Sitting down in a chair in front of the stove, I pressed my gun to my side and fell asleep. I was awakened by the loud calling of crows. It was a clear morning. I checked my watch. It was almost 8 in the morning. The front door creaked open, and Licia appeared on the doorstep with a kettle in her hand, greeting me politely. Good morning. Come and have some tea, I invited her. Have you already had tea? She bent over to rub her feet, still waking up. I'm later after you. Somehow she seemed hesitant. Bring another cup and sit down, I suggested, pulling a stool for her. It wasn't much of a breakfast. The guest apparently didn't dare to open the refrigerator. I got up, opened the door, took out a can of stew and some eggs. Have a seat. We're about to have a real breakfast, I said, handing her the groceries. I went into the hallway, quickly washing my face from a washstand hanging there. In 15 minutes, the table was adorned with a frying pan with fried eggs and stew, a plate with butter, and a vase with sweets. Licia sat motionless with her hands folded in her lap. Well, what about you? Eat, or it will get cold, I encouraged her. I put a big piece of eggs on her plate and poured a cup of fragrant tea. Will you eat with me? She asked quietly, looking straight ahead. Of course, let's eat. Otherwise, I have to go to town. I ate with gusto, drinking sweet tea. Thank you. I should probably go. Ivan would be angry, she said uncertainly. He threw you out. Why should you be angry? What will you have for breakfast? I got up from the table. I have to go now, eat. Don't hurry. Don't put the dishes away, lock the house and put the key over the front door. 40 minutes later, I arrived at the courthouse. It didn't take long to process the divorce papers, and by 10 to 11, I was sitting on a bench in the square in front of the court. I left the car a block away, just in case. At precisely 11 o'clock, Sveda's black Lexus stopped in front of the courthouse. My wife looked like a goddess who had come down to earth. I silently watched Sveda's appearance, making no attempt to attract her attention. How long have you been waiting? She asked, sitting down on the edge of the bench and scenting me with expensive perfume. Are you sulking at me? After all, nothing terrible happened. I've earned the right to a private life. I remained silent, stubbornly refusing to engage. I still love you, and I'm not going to change anything in our lives. But I'm a woman. I want attention and love. You've shot me down in every way, both as a husband and as a man. But for a woman's health, she needs some variety. She hesitated for a moment. That boy, you scared him to death. I need him to keep me in shape, to keep me healthy, after all. She looked at me questioningly, waiting for a reaction, but I stubbornly remained silent. Even Masha supported me. She totally agreed with me and thought that having a young partner at my age is quite normal. By the way, Igor, a friend of her young man, was the one who asked him to find me a healthy, understanding boy. I pondered the reasons behind Moshe's smirk and the contemptuous glances he threw my way. The respect that once existed, the bond of family and marriage, had long dissipated. Finally, Europe concluded its nonsensical pursuits, and I yearned for a return to the sanctuary of family. That's enough, I urged. Satisfy your male ego elsewhere. In defiance, she asserted, many women in our circle follow my lead, and their husbands are perfectly content. If you love me, you must understand me. A hand gently landed on my knee, a gesture seeking reconciliation. Let's make peace. You are my husband, and I love only you. My stomach churned at those words. With 2 fingers, I delicately removed her hand from my knee. Don't waste time with words, I retorted, avoiding eye contact. The divorce papers were filed, and I saw no hindrance to expanding my personal life, perhaps with a few more lovers. Her tone shifted abruptly. You're not getting a divorce, she declared. I'll put you in an asylum, and I'll visit occasionally with my next lover. Better yet, I'll make you crawl back to me, serving as a witness to my newfound pleasures. In disbelief, I resisted. Who do you think you are? Her face flushed with anger. Tomorrow, our kids and I are leaving for Cyprus, where my business partner has a luxurious villa. We'll be there for 2 weeks, and Igor's joining me. They'll always be there for me, and I'll share my bed with him as I please. If you decide to return, everything can be as it was. The choice is yours. With a cold demeanor, she handed me an open-date plane ticket. You can come whenever you want. I've said my piece. The decision is yours. Without saying goodbye, she walked to the car and sat down in the driver's seat. As the car drove away, her daughter's face flashed through the window. I was already on the highway when Dima called. His barrage of questions mirrored the confusion and hurt I felt. Daddy, is it true you left Mom? You lived together for so many years. What happened? Did you find someone else? The questions were coming in like peace. Dima, calm down. These are questions you should ask your mother or your sister. I was talking and keeping my eyes on the road. Daddy, don't twist my words. Mom and Masha told me everything. How could you? I don't want to know you after that. He turned off the phone. I remembered an expression I read in some book. If a child after 15 years has not become your friend, if he does not rave about his father, he is a stranger to you. If the son does not worship his father, he is not your son. As I drove on, I reflected on the decades invested in raising our children, providing for the family, and now finding myself discarded and disrespected. The road stretched ahead, a metaphor for the unknown journey I was embarking on. The journey to rediscover myself and confront the harsh reality of a family unraveling at its seams. The scene at my house was surreal. There was a police car with its blinker on outside my house. I stopped the car and got out. There was a policeman standing on the porch pounding on the door with his fist, and the other one was sitting in the car muttering something into the radio station. I walked around the police and asked politely, "Gentlemen, what's the matter?" The policeman on the porch paid no attention to me, continuing to pound on the door with the tenacity of a woodpecker. "Who are you?" There was a hoarse voice behind me. I turned around, and the second policeman was standing there with a stick at the ready, looking at me wearily. "Me, the owner of this house and of this property which you have entered without my permission. Have you any papers?" The first one stopped pounding on the door and turned to me. "Yes, they are in the house." I pushed the policeman aside and reached over the door with my hand. There was no key. Someone was in the house, most likely my guest who never got out to his beloved Ivan Lucia. "It's me. Don't be afraid to open." I knocked on the door. The woman stood at the door itself, for she opened it at once. I stepped into the hallway. The policeman tried to squeeze in behind me. "Gentlemen, do you have a warrant?" The officers looked at me like I was crazy. "This woman's husband has filed a search warrant for her. We have to take her into custody and bring her to the station. As far as I know, she was only kicked out of the house last night. I wonder when her landlord had time to file a report." I spoke very politely, remembering to press the call button on my cell phone in my pocket. One of the policemen pushed me away and went into the house. I listened as one of the policemen spoke mockingly. "Listen, get ready. Your husband was waiting for me." The second one added, "And you, get ready. Let's see who you are." Suddenly, I felt a sharp blow from the second policeman's stick under my breath. The force knocked the air out of me, and I doubled over, hands on my chest. Lucia wanted to help, but one of the policemen grabbed her arm and dragged her towards the car. The other policeman lifted me by the collar and punched me in the chest again, saying, "You should be simpler, uncle, and people will reach out to you." He laughed loudly and said, "Citizen of Lila claims that you tricked her into the house and abused her. What do you have to say about that?" The interrogator looked at me predatorily, mentioning traces of beatings on her body. I wanted to get it over with quickly. "May I see Citizen of Lever?" I asked. The policeman put aside a fine piece of paper and suggested confessing. I found a quiet corner, seeking solitude. Just then, the door opened, and a major walked in. Judging by the brisk response of the interrogator, he was a big boss. He waved lazily at the master in charge, took the interrogation report, and said, "Sorry, Yuri, there was a misunderstanding. Citizen of Lever was mistaken. You are free to go." The major glared at the policeman, and I left the police station. A black Jeep with tinted windows awaited me outside. I sat down next to the driver, and the car shifted smoothly. A few meters away, I witnessed a drunken man assaulting Lucia, with a wretched old woman standing nearby muttering to her. Unable to stand by, I touched the driver's shoulder and opened the door. "Do you need any help?" he asked without turning his head. "I can do it myself," I replied. Without getting into a debate with the man, I kicked him under the knee. When he turned around, I punched him in the nose with all my might. Something crunched, and the man drove his head into the side windshield of his car, leaving a trail of blood. The woman standing nearby opened her mouth to yell but changed her mind when she caught my gaze. I walked over to Lucia. "Will you come with me?" I asked Lucia. She nodded, and I gestured for her to get in the car. Glancing back at the man lying on the ground, I hoped for no further aggression. I got in the front seat, slammed the door, and with winter's arrival, I set out. The road to the highway was blocked and covered in snow. I struck a deal in the village, and a tractor driver managed to clear the road for the cost of 2 bottles of vodka. The noise of a car engine woke me up, and as I cautiously got off the bed, I shivered from the cold. Heading to the window, I saw a big black car stopping right in front of the house. A figure emerged from the car, a bodyguard in all his primal glory, followed by my estranged wife, Sveta. She slipped, but a young man accompanying her managed to support her by the elbow. They stared at the house, as if expecting the wizard of the Emerald City to appear. I put on my coat and went out onto the porch, remaining silent. The uninvited guests were the first to break the silence. "Are you the host?" the bodyguard asked menacingly. I threw my jacket on the parapet, came down from the porch, and it seemed the man was in a belligerent mood. Talik, Sveta's lawyer, suddenly calmed down, came forward, and spoke. Vida and I need to talk. Maybe you want to invite me into the house. I shrugged, and Sveta called someone named Samuel from the car. Come on in, I said, though I added, frankly, I don't like uninvited guests. Cautiously stepping on the icy steps, Sveta and the lawyer entered the hallway. I extended my hand to prevent the third man from following them. We need to talk to your mother, he said, but I stopped him with my hand against his chest. His face contorted with rage, but he couldn't do anything, and he knew it. Lucia turned around at the door and greeted the uninvited guest politely. She quickly realized that Sveta was my wife, evident from the jealousy in her eyes. Sveta also looked curiously at Lucia, quickly getting the hint that she was comforting me. Unable to contain her emotions, she muttered through her teeth, "Tell me what you want," to which I responded angrily. The lawyer sat down on a stool and opened his briefcase. Yuri, your wife is suing the court to declare you incompetent. You had a severe concussion in the past, leading to complications and a temporary mental disorder. You should be examined at a psychiatric hospital to determine your legal capacity. The question is whether you will do so voluntarily or whether we will have to go to the appropriate authorities to enforce your appearance. As far as I understand, the examination is done by court order. Do you have it in your hands? The lawyer explained. I looked at the lawyer calmly and questioned, and where do you want to forcibly lock me up in a mental hospital? My defiance somewhat discouraged the lawyer. Yura, I'm worried about your health. You need to take a course of treatment. The doctors will help you get rid of your obsessions, and you'll go back to your family. The children are so upset, they want to see you. Sveta almost sobbed with resentment. For the children? The question is, do I want to see them? I thought aloud and said, I understand your desire to quickly put me in the asylum ostensibly for my own good. But you were in a hurry. There was no trial, and I don't need any counseling. I won't discuss anything with you. Sweeter, take your lackeys and get off my land. I looked expressively at the gun hanging on the wall. Are you threatening, Samuel? Sveta asked. I told you, he's inadequate and aggressive, I replied. In that case, we are forced to ask for help, the lawyer declared. Sveta was about to speak again, but I tried to calm the situation, saying, let's solve everything in peace, Yura. It's all for your own good. You'll thank me later. However, she took a step towards me, attempting to hug me. Come on, get out of here, I said, pointedly looking at the hanging shotgun. You're crazy for sure. She shrieked and looked at the lawyer. Samuel, do something. I held the gun with the barrel down, telling them to leave. You're threatening us with a gun. You really are crazy, the lawyer exclaimed. He jumped up, knocking over a stool, grabbed my wife by the arm, and dragged her toward the exit. They tumbled off the porch in a heap, and I followed them out, instructing them to get in the car and leave. Before I could say anything more, a policeman pulled up to the house. The door opened, and gun-wielding soldiers poured out, surrounding the house and cutting off my escape route. A bubbly major announced to the loudspeaker, Yura Kolosov, drop your weapons and come out with your hands up. It seemed Sveta had decided to take any means necessary to hold me. However, my respect for her waned quickly. A black SUV drove up, and a young man stepped out, assessing the chaotic scene. He turned to the frozen policeman, asking, who's in charge? The bumpy major approached, and the man identified himself, Colonel Kazantsev, head of the Special Operations Division of the Department of National Security. On what grounds and by whose order are the special forces involved? He asked the colonel, seeking clarity. Well, that is, we received a call that a man was holding a hostage in this house, the major explained, clearly out of his depth. They said that the owner of this house is crazy. Take your men and go away. We'll deal with you later. Sveta and her companions froze in place as the situation rapidly changed. The policeman quickly piled into the minibus and drove away. The colonel approached Sveta's car and greeted her. Hello, Svetlana. She raised her eyebrows in surprise. Only an absentia. Mr. General told me about you, the colonel explained, adding, only good things. My advice to you, solve everything amicably. Sveta looked dazedly between me and the colonel. Did you say general? She asked in surprise. Yes, for the whole year, and you did not know. My former deputy headed towards me. Hello, Yuri, why didn't you make your wife happy? He said with a smile as he approached the porch. Sometimes it's better to know less, even for devoted wives, I replied, shaking his outstretched hand. Lucia stayed with me for a while, gradually falling out. Her roommate made no more attempts to take her back, knowing full well the consequences. Surprisingly, the police no longer bothered me either. It seemed that underground channels leaked information about a retired general who didn't appreciate uninvited guests. I took Lucia into town, and we visited a beauty salon and several fancy boutiques. The transformation was remarkable. She went from a frightened girl to a beautiful princess. We also visited a clinic where I knew a doctor. They examined Lucia and found nothing dangerous except for one heartbreaking revelation. She would never have children again due to the effects of numerous abortions performed at one time on the orders of her master. I did not ask how old she was, but she looked about 30. She had her whole life ahead of her. Despite the fact that I really liked her, I tried to keep her at a distance, cutting off all attempts to get close to me in every way. You can't cheat age. She was too young and too beautiful to be with me. My train had already skipped past the penultimate station and was approaching its terminus at breakneck speed. Besides, I was fed up with being in a relationship with a woman and didn't want any more disappointments or problems. A month later, some distant relative of hers came along and invited her to stay with her. Lucia was in a hurry. I supplied her with money and wished her happiness. The last night before she left, Lucia came to me, and I could not resist. How can a single man refuse something beautiful and young? It all happened once. The whole time, she was waiting for me to ask her to stay, but I said nothing. In the morning, she stood by the cab for a long time, still hoping for something, and then she left my life. We divorced Sveta in the end, although she begged me in court not to leave her. As if she wasn't the one who had taken a young lover under my nose and been fooling around with him for almost 6 months. I even had my doubts about having kids, but the DNA test reassured me. The absence of her husband took its toll on Savita. It was obvious that she really regretted our breakup. My ex-wife came to see me several times and begged me to forgive her. She said that she had broken up with her lover at once, and that she was carrying her love around with her to piss me off, and she succeeded. I, of course, forgave her. So many years have passed. I never went back to her children. As for the children, I love them, but I don't let them near me, especially my daughter. Still, there's a very fresh resentment. Masha also tried to talk to me, but I categorically refused to engage in a conversation with her. God is her judge. The receptionist stood up. Mr. General, the director is waiting for you. When I entered the office, Vardik stood up from his desk and came out to meet me. We embraced, and he asked, "How did you do it?" I pulled away and looked at my friend. It was almost impossible. Vardik, the director of the Department of National Security, laughed, saying, "Well, no more difficult than you, Yura, pulling me badly wounded from the battlefield. Take over the position, no more sitting in retirement." He was silent for a while, then smiling slyly, he asked, "Have some cognac?" A year has passed. My car was rushing along the highway, dispersing the light snow that had fallen overnight, leaving a fast-living trail behind it. In some places, I could still see the miraculously preserved bright red and yellow foliage, especially against the background of the green, brown, or tawny forest. I even felt sorry for it. For a minute, I returned from my business trip and was on my way home, where I hadn't been in more than a month. All that time, I had been living alone, enjoying my freedom. I had rebuilt the house, traveled a lot, and only now did I get a real taste of life. But more and more often at night, I dreamed about Lucia. Alas, the past could not be undone. I knew that we were not destined to be together, and she never even called me once during all this time. Apparently, she had found her happiness after all. Still, I put the old lock on the new door, just in case. And when I left, I always kept the key in its old place. After 10 kilometers, I turned off onto an unpaved road. The wheels crunched the thin ice and puddles, glistening in the dim autumn sun. The road turned sharply to the left and ended in a one-story house made of pine logs. I parked the car, took a bulky bag out of the truck, and went up to the porch. Suddenly, the door opened, and a young woman with a baby in her arms came out towards me. "Hi, Lucy," I greeted her. She shyly looked into my eyes. "We were waiting for you." The sun was shining brightly, the sky was almost clear, and its dazzling blue caught my eyes. A fresh breeze from the lake played with the tops of the tall pines, lifting up sparkling white clouds. Dear listener, if you have reached this far, please click on the subscribe button. It will be a great help.